Hello and welcome to Nuzlocke University. Today we're going to talk about how you can get better at Nuzlocke team building. Now, a quick disclaimer before we get started. I love Nuzlockes. I play a lot of them, normally with hardcore rules, but I am not one of the best Nuzlockers in the world. I don't usually tackle difficult ROM hacks or anything like that. But with that said, I do love to talk and write about Nuzlockes. I have my own website called Nuzlocke University where I share tier lists, guides, articles, and other tips for new and experienced Nuzlockers. So I'll leave a link in the description if you'd like to check that out. So if you're already a super skilled Nuzlocker, you're challenging Emerald Kaizo and Run and Bun and all those crazy high difficulty ROM hacks and rule sets and stuff like that, then this video may not be for you. You may still find it interesting, but it's probably not going to change the way that you play. But if you are a new, novice, or kind of mid-level Nuzlocker, and you're just looking to improve your Nuzlocke skills, then you are in the right place, so let's get started. Nothing is more important to the success of a player than building the right team of Pokémon, and that is even more true in the Nuzlocke Challenge. So I'm going to give you 5 tips that will help you improve your Nuzlocke team building and give you a better chance of success. But even before we can do that, we need to talk about what kind of player you are, because there's 2 main ways that people approach the Nuzlocke Challenge. The first is playing blind, or without researching fights beforehand. The second, of course, is the opposite of that, and that is to play with access to online resources like Cerebi and Bulbapedia, and allow yourself to look up important information before each fight. And the way that you decide to play is going to have a big impact on how you approach team building in your Nuzlocke. If you're playing blinds, then you're going to rely more heavily on basic principles of team building, and we're going to discuss that. But if you're researching things beforehand and allowing yourself that information, then building specifically for the challenging fights in whatever game you're playing is going to have a much bigger impact on your team building approach. So anyways, with all that out of the way, we can finally get into our 5 tips for improving your team building skills. And we're going to start with tip 1, type coverage is key. So early on in their Pokemon journey, every player pretty quickly learns that it's important to carry and use a variety of different Pokemon types. We are taught the importance of the grass, water, and fire triangle right away, and for many casual players, their team building thoughts stop here, which, to be honest, is perfectly fine if you're playing a mainline Pokemon game because the series is not exactly known for its difficulty. But in a Nuzlocke, where our encounters are limited and the margin for error is so much lower, this takes on an even greater importance, and we take it a little bit further. So as we alluded to a moment ago, it's a good idea to start with a type core, or a type triangle, to ensure that our basic weaknesses are covered. We already mentioned the classic fire, water, grass triangle, but there's also the fighting, dark, psychic triangle, the steel, fairy, dragon triangle, and I'm sure there are others that I'm just not thinking of at the moment. And these triangles really form the foundation, or the backbone, of our team building approach. You know, for new players, these triangles provide a template that we can plug Pokemon into, and if you follow the triangle, you can be reasonably sure that most of your bases are covered. Now, of course, in a triangle, there are only 3 Pokemon, which leaves 3 other team slots that we need to fill, but we can start to consider how we can cover the weaknesses of whatever our chosen triangle is and include other Pokemon that strengthen that backbone. As an example, electric types tend to complement a fire, water, grass core very effectively because they cover for the flying type Pokemon that are common in the early game and provide redundancy against the also common water types that you'll face. Many common water types, like Tentacruel and Gyarados, take only neutral damage from grass type attacks, and so having an electric type available can improve your matchup against these Pokemon. Now, another slightly more advanced way that we can take advantage of the types of our Pokemon is by setting up pivoting cores. So what is pivoting? Well, pivoting is switching between multiple Pokemon in order to manipulate the opposing trainer into using certain moves which we can take advantage of, often to get other Pokemon on our team in for free. Now, if you're playing on Switch mode, this really does not matter because you'll be given the opportunity to switch your Pokemon after you knock out one of your opponents. But if you're playing on set mode and don't have that ability, then being able to bring a Pokemon in without taking damage is extremely important. Certain Pokemon types tend to make for very effective pivots, especially when those types have immunities. A good example of this is the Ghost type's immunity to normal and vice versa, or the Flying type's immunity to ground type moves. Abilities that granted immunity, like Levitate, also make a Pokemon a great pivot. Now we should probably back up a little bit here and say that the reason pivoting works is because the AI in Pokemon games is extremely predictable. If it sees a kill on our Pokemon with one of its moves, it will almost always use that move, allowing us to anticipate what's coming. This is why, for example, a Pokemon like Gyarados is a great pivot and can be combined with Swampert to make a great pivoting core. Even though both of these Pokemon share the water type, and so we might not think they'd be compatible, Gyarados, being a water flying type, can draw electric type attacks, which Swampert, as a water ground type, is immune to, allowing Swampert to swap in for free. Gyarados is also a very easy Pokemon to pivot into because of its flying type, which gives it immunity to ground type moves. So any Pokemon which is weak to a ground type move, such as our electric type, can come in, bait the ground type move, and then bring in Gyarados for free. And that's not even mentioning Gyarados' Intimidate ability, which lowers the opponent's attack every time he switches in. He's just a fantastic pivot, just a fantastic Pokemon overall. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Anyways, I hope that both of these examples, both the type triangles we talked about and these pivot cores, can show you how important the typing of our Pokemon is when we are building the backbone of our team. Now, tip 2 is specifically for players who are not playing blind, who are researching their fights beforehand, but if you are, I think it's the most important single thing you can do to improve your team building. And that is to build specifically for the difficult fights you'll face in your run, and to identify specific Pokemon that can take on the most dangerous threats that you'll face. And the reason for this, I think, is pretty clear. I think if you have a team which is great on paper, which has great type coverage and seems to handle pretty much everything, except for the one difficult rival battle that you'll face halfway through the game, well then it doesn't matter how well that team is constructed on paper, it's still going to lose when you come up to that fight. I sometimes call these Pokemon, which are very specific answers to a particular fight, tech Pokemon, and that's how I'll refer to them for the rest of the video. Often, these tech Pokemon might be non-obvious. They might not be great Pokemon outside of their role in that specific fight. If you're looking at a tier list, they might be in the lower tiers. But because of their role in that specific fight, sometimes, even though they're not a good Pokemon, they can be the right Pokemon for your team. My favorite example of this is Dustox in Pokemon Emerald, specifically against the Norman Slacking fight. By this point in the game, Dustox's stats have been outclassed, it's been passed by the game's power curve, and so outside of this fight, it's not an obvious bring for your team. But against Norman Slacking specifically, it has one big advantage, which is that it learns Protect naturally before the level cap for this gym. And combine that with Slacking's Truant ability, which makes it skip every other turn, and suddenly you can attack on the Truant turns, and Protect on the active turns, and now this otherwise weak Pokemon has invalidated this challenging fight. So anyways, that's just one example. There are lots of great examples like this, and finding those and identifying them is one of the things that'll improve your Nuzlocke skills the most. So for tip number 3 now, we're moving away from specific building for a particular fight, and we're going back to more fundamental principles of team building. And what we're talking about next for tip 3 is being aware of the different roles that each Pokemon fills and making sure that you have enough of each to cover your bases on your team. Now, I'm sure you could go into way more depth, way more detail, and break this down into an almost arbitrary number of different roles, but for our purposes, we're going to talk about 3 today. And those are sweepers, tanks, and supports. Now, if you're familiar with the MMO concept of the Holy Trinity, of DPS, tank, healer, this will sound pretty familiar, and the concept is very similar. First, let's talk about sweepers. So sweepers are the DPS equivalent on our Pokemon team, and their job is to come in, punch big holes in the opposing team, and then get out safely. The most important stats for a sweeper are speed, to make sure that it goes first, and high attack stat or special attack stat depending on the Pokemon. Good defenses are a bonus for when something goes wrong and this Pokemon takes a hit, but if everything goes according to plan, our sweepers should not be taking a high amount of damage anyway. For sweepers to work effectively, they usually need 2 things. They need type advantage, and they need a way to get in safely without taking damage. This is where pivoting becomes extremely important if you remember from point 1. Now, especially in lower difficulty or vanilla Nuzlocks, sweepers are the most important role on our team. And in a basic, say, fire red or leaf green Nuzlocke, your team might actually be made up of 6 sweepers. And in each battle, you just pick the appropriate sweeper, send it in, and finish the fight that way. Even in higher difficulty, more demanding Nuzlocks, it's not uncommon to see 3 or 4 sweepers form the core of our team. The next role we need to understand is the tank. Now for the tank, high defenses, bulky HP, and good defensive typing form the core of their usefulness. Their job is often to act as a stabilizer when something else goes wrong. We expect that we can switch them in and allow them to take damage for us while we do whatever we need to do to get back in the fight. Often, tanks will have some sort of offensive ability as well, whether that's through their own attacks or through status moves such as Toxic and Leech Seed, which can allow us to creatively play around difficult encounters when we don't have a sweeper that can get the job done. Often, tanks will also act as pseudo-pivots. They may not have an immunity to an attack we expect, but they might be able to either resist it or simply tank it through sheer stats alone and bring in our sweeper. If you're allowing healing items in your Nuzlocke, your tank can also sit on the field and tank damage while you heal up the rest of your team, though this is not relevant for players who are using the hardcore rule set. Now finally, let's talk about support Pokemon. So the support Pokemon is a more ambiguous category in Nuzlocking than it is in other games, because there is very little direct healing in Pokemon. It does exist, you can use moves like Wish to heal up the rest of your team, but often doing so safely is difficult, and so the support will often take a different role. Sometimes this will be to set up hazards, such as Stealth Rock or Spikes, to enable your sweepers to do their jobs more efficiently. Sometimes they'll take the role of a very flexible pivot, which you can use to bring in different Pokemon safely. And sometimes they'll simply use status-inducing or stat-reducing moves, such as Thunder Wave to paralyze, or Growl to reduce attack, in order to make it safer for our other Pokemon to get in and do their jobs. So the ratio of each role that we should have on our team is going to depend on the game and the specific fight, but as a general rule, either 3 sweepers, 2 tanks, and 1 support, or 4 sweepers with 1 tank and 1 support tend to be common ways to build those teams. Now, moving on. We're going to present Tip 4 and Tip 5 together because they tend to be heavily related and intertwined in team building. So Tip 4 is redundancy, and Tip 5 is role compression. Now, redundancy can be explained simply as having a backup plan built into our team building. So it's not always a bad thing to have Pokemon that share a type, especially a very useful type such as the water type. During a long Nuzlocke run, it is very likely that something will go sideways during one of your battles. And if we have no redundancy built into our team, then as soon as one of our important Pokemon faints, the rest of our game plan may fall apart completely. Now, you might say, okay, well that's nice, but I've only got 6 Pokemon slots and I don't want them to all do the same thing. I need them to fulfill lots of different roles. So how do I build redundancy into my team without sacrificing flexibility? And the answer to that is in tip number 5, role compression. Role compression refers to a Pokemon's ability to perform multiple functions effectively. Now, what these functions are can get extremely granular and extremely specific to the battles that we're facing, but generally, a Pokemon which can act as both a sweeper and a tank, or as both a tank and a support, will have additional value to us because by combining those roles into a single team slot, we're able to fit more roles, more functions into those limited 6 team slots that we have. This is one of the many things that makes Gyarados such an effective Nuzlocke Pokemon. In fact, I would say the very best Nuzlocke Pokemon. Not only does it have the stats to function as a sweeper as well as the moveset, it also has the Intimidate ability, which allows it to function both as a tank by lowering the opponent's attack, increasing its effective bulk, and also weakening that Pokemon for the rest of our team. And that's not even mentioning its typing, which allows it to act as one of the best pivots in the game. So put that all together, and Gyarados is one of the best sweepers, one of the best tanks, and one of the best supports available to us. And if we can condense all those roles into a single team slot, it makes our team that much stronger and more flexible. So there you go, 5 tips for improving your Nuzlocke team building skills. Now, like I said at the start, if you are a high skill, high difficulty Nuzlocker, you probably didn't learn anything brand new in this video, but I still hope you enjoyed and had an interesting time listening. And if you're a new or intermediate player, I hope you learned something that can improve your Nuzlocke skills going forward. If you have any other Nuzlocke team building tips in mind, please share them with others in the comments below. If you enjoyed, please don't forget to like and subscribe. This is a brand new channel, so anything you can do to show the algorithm that we are worth listening to helps a lot. If you're interested in seeing more Nuzlocke tier lists, guides, tips, and other content like that, visit my website at Nuzlocke University. I'll leave a link in the description. Thanks for watching, and happy Nuzlocking!